Good morning, everybody. My name's Dave Ripplinger. I'm actually native of Devil's Lake. Would much rather be there than here today. Bit of a blizzard, at least earlier this morning, between West Fargo and the Lake region, so I couldn't make it up. The course is extension. I'd much rather be there in person. I like that we're a face-to-face organization most of the time. I guess technology will get us to where we're at today. Happy to answer any questions. I know with this format, it might be a little bit difficult. I'll be happy to answer questions at the end of this presentation. If you have any other ones, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is at the end of the presentation, and I'm online, and the local folks who put on Roundup can put you in as well. Today I'm going to talk about carbon credits. So this is an area that I've worked on for about a decade in carbon. I'm the biofuels guy, and so greenhouse gas emissions have quite a bit to do with why we have biofuels in this country, at least why we started having corn ethanol in this country and other biofuels. And it's really became something else in the last year or so. And so I'm going to talk about carbon credits and how they're impacting production agriculture, and hopefully to give everybody enough background so you understand what's going on if you get an email or a phone call from someone interested in visiting with you about signing a carbon offset contract. So really straightforward, if I can get my clicker to work. Starting back, so what's carbon? So really straightforward. So we say carbon a lot, and really when we say carbon, we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's this general concern for greenhouse gas emissions and how they might be impacting climate. But we use this term carbon pretty common. So that carbon offset is typically what you'll see like in the ag press or when those sales reps might come to you, talk about signing an agreement. Why do we call it carbon? Well, carbon dioxide is by far the largest greenhouse gas by volume, but it's certainly not the only one. And in some respects, including in terms of agriculture, it's not by itself like by far the most important. There's others like methane and nitrous oxide, which are smaller in volume, but each one of those are much more impactful in terms of actually trapping heat in the atmosphere. And these both have an ag dimension to them as well. So methane from ruminants, especially, we have that. And then nitrous oxide from the nitrogen that we apply to our fields that doesn't make it into the plant like we want to do, is oftentimes typically emitted as nitrous oxide, and that's a really bad greenhouse gas. So why is it getting so much attention? Of course, to you, you're probably getting emails or hearing about or even talking about these offers to do no-till or to plant cover crops, but it's coming from outside of agriculture. We just had a UN study, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, just had their 6th climate report that says we're in a really bad place in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and what climate might look like. And that's motivated a lot of different folks, including governments, national governments and private businesses to take an active approach. One of the things I'll say about this in general is it doesn't really matter what you think about this because it's a real situation. I'm going to talk about it today mostly as an opportunity, as folks are going to be coming to you, offering to give you money for a new practice. At the same time, it may be coming to you in terms of regulation, which would obviously not be desired. What I would really think or like you to frame this as is we grow a lot of crops in North Dakota. As a farmer, you don't necessarily consume some of those crops, but if there's a buyer for lentils somewhere and you can make money growing lentils, you'll oftentimes grow lentils. And so if we can park some of those concerns about what we think about greenhouse gas emissions or climate, both the science and the politics associated, we can get a little bit further. Again, what's being offered right now is money on the table. So one of the things I had on the previous slide was Microsoft, like many multinational organizations, is investing tens of millions of dollars individually, collectively in the billions of dollars in reducing their carbon emissions. So those, for the most part, associated with their business. So what they can do this in one of 4 ways. So they can reduce their own emissions. That's called a scope 1 reduction. They could reduce the emissions from the energy that they use. So if they buy electricity off the grid, a lot of these folks now are contracting for solar or wind. They might be reducing emissions from their suppliers or customers. if those folks have significant emissions. And finally, if there's nothing within their business, their suppliers or their customers, they go out and look for what's called a carbon offset. So somewhere else in the economy, will someone else reduce their emissions in exchange for cash? And then the people, for example, a Microsoft would buy those offsets and count them as their own. And so that's what a carbon offset is. So it's not attached to the business directly, and you're going to have this reduction in carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really what we're talking about, and this is what the Bears and the Norries and the farm business networks and all of those folks are interested in, is signing carbon offset contracts with farmers, again, to have that reduction in emissions away from that business, but again, it would offset the emissions that Microsoft might have, but they're being offset by agriculture, so another part of the economy. And just so you know, what we typically talk about is these emissions are measured in metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So again, I said CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas, it's just the most abundant by volume. We convert all of those different greenhouse gases into a CO2 equivalent in terms of how they impact global warming. And that's really what these folks are buying and selling. What the people between a Microsoft and you want to do is bundle all of these carbon offsets, which are measured in metric tons, and then sell those to a Microsoft. So one of the things I think that's really important, again, I've worked with carbon for more than a decade, ever since I've been in this position, there's a lot more to carbon decarbonization than just carbon offsets. Gotten a lot of attention in the press and the ag press in the last year, and I think that's a good thing. Generally, there's a lot been going on in agriculture and a lot of ag news. It's been a kind of an exciting year. 2022 is going to likely be the same. But I want everybody to understand that these carbon offsets are just part of a bigger puzzle. You know, they are a voluntary transaction, and there's also at the same time some huge things going on the regulatory side, and also some potential larger opportunities or changes in the market on the market side or the private side. So, for example, one of the things that we work with, and something that affects you as a North Dakota farmer, is actually California's low carbon fuel market. Their fuel standard generates credits, and the size of that market, even though you may have never heard of it, you don't directly interact with it, it's about 100 times as large. It was 100 times as large last year as these carbon offsets in agriculture. Maybe there was about $50 million or so in carbon offsets in agriculture. There was, in excess of $5 billion in carbon credits for these California carbon credits. And these are really important because those California carbon credits are driving investment and desire for corn ethanol, including corn ethanol that we produce in the state. And again, which many of those refineries would be buying corn from you. And so that doesn't directly touch you like the carbon offsets do, but the point is that it's just one piece. What we're talking about is one really small piece. Here's another way to put it. This is a slide from a group called the Ag Funders Network. It's kind of a news service for folks working in venture capital and ag. And here's their big chart of carbon credits by dollar value and where the money's going to. So if you can think, this is Microsoft as they're sitting in Redmond trying to decide where they're going to put this money to buy offsets. Where's it going? Well, I already mentioned that upper right-hand corner, or that upper left-hand corner, says renewable energy. So about a third of it has gone to things like buying renewable energy, solar, wind, to supply their corporate offices, their data farms, and the like, right? That's actually a really easy thing to do. The other biggest piece, right, I'm sure you saw this, is that almost the whole bottom half, 45.8% of the carbon credits issued are actually forest and land. And this was another thing, was really easy for folks looking for carbon offsets to go find owners of timberland, for those owners to either agree to, if they hadn't already agreed to, certain sustainable management practices, and then to generate offsets. And so you can see that's just this huge part. And then if we look at ag, well, ag to date has really only been 1%. So absolutely tiny. The expectation is over time, over the next 20, 30, 40 years, it would become at least of the same approximate size as renewable energy, about a third of what's going on. And again, that would take time to do, but we're really in the early stages of the development of that business or that sector or that market. And a lot of the interactions that you experience are kind of these first steps by a number of people to get into it. Here's a survey now. It's a little bit old. This was done by Purdue. They asked farmers across the Midwest. It's a little bit weighted more towards the Corn Belt side of things than the Northern Plains or even the Great Plains generally. But they just wanted to know what farmers knew about what was going on. So, are you aware of that these opportunities exist? At that time it was mostly no. I would say by now it's probably mostly yes. But of those who knew, have you had a conversation? Overwhelmingly no. And those who had a conversation, have you signed anything? Still overwhelmingly no. In my conversations with farmers, in this part of the country, there's certainly some who have signed up for carbon contracts, but there's many who have had a conversation. There's also a bunch who are pretty hesitant and not particularly interested, motivated to engage in those conversations just based on what they already know. One of the things to take note is the importance and the existence of these things called carbon registries. So a carbon registry is an organization and process where a person would go to say, hey, I have these practices, they reduce carbon emissions. You submit it to that registry, they approve it or disapprove it. And when they approve it, that is essentially where this carbon offset is approved, validated, verified. So again, what could happen, in general, we're seeing a farmer would sign an agreement with this third-party business, a bear, if you will. Bear would then go to a carbon registry, say that, we've contracted with this farmer for, 500 acres of land that's going to be grown under no-till for the first time, or that might have cover crops. That carbon registry would say, okay, we got it. That's going to generate 40 metric tons of CO2 reduction. And then that business, that bear could then go to Microsoft and say, hey, we have this many carbon offsets. You said you were going to pay this. We're happy to take it. Already talked about this a little bit. So what are they looking at? They're really looking at two things, although they are starting to expand this more broad, which I think is a really good idea. So they've talked a lot about strip till and no-till, as well as cover crops. And I think to some extent, there's a really big opportunity for us to capture carbon in our soils. We've seen this already. The challenge with this is the science isn't exactly precise, which can lead to issues. But those two things have really kind of taken the lead in what those third parties are looking for, but they're not the only ones. One of the big challenges for me is in many cases, the decision is being framed as, would you adopt no-till or start growing cover crops? And that's a really tough decision, right? So I've built decision models, and if you guys ever want to see some decision models on that, the actual decision to change your tillage practices or to grow cover crops is pretty tough. And for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, fields are different. And so not each field is going to have the same benefits or costs when you change these practices. That, upfront every year going forward, one of the biggest issues is a lot of the benefits they're real, and most of them in many cases accrue to the farmer, but they're not financial. So it might be something where if I have no-till, I can enter my field earlier. I can better manage my moisture, so I might not have to worry as much about flooding or about field being dry, and that has a benefit. But again, what's that worth? There's not a market for that. It's worth something to an individual farmer, but it's difficult to price. As an economist, we can and do price things like that. But for any individual decision, it's really up to the farmer, what is that worth? In some cases too, you'll see increase in soil health, which have a variety of benefits. And some of those, especially over the longer term, could be increased yields. You'd have a healthier, more robust soil. Maybe you decrease salinity, you do X, Y, Z. It's great, but the actual value of the land of those small changes is really tough to quantify and to turn into dollars. And then one of the questions we have is, well, how do you actually finance this? And there's a number of people who are looking at that and looking at some non-conventional ways of financing cover crops, conversions to no-till and the like. And then, of course, too, even for your local ag lender, how do you sit down and say, gosh, I'm doing business with this farmer. I want to continue to do business with this farmer. This is a good thing. I know that, but how do I price it? How do I determine the risk and exactly how my bank might want to finance this opportunity? Another big issue: costs are up front, benefits are backloaded. You might take a yield hit, or for cover crops, you have an explicit financial cost of putting the crop in, and it could be years or decades until you see the benefits. That's really tough. And then finally, the biggest thing is it's really tough to quantify the benefits both into the future, but especially precisely. And so that becomes a challenge. I work a lot with our soil scientists at NDSU, with NDSU Extension, and soil science is a really neat field, but it's really complex. And there's a lot going on within soils, and just the ability to measure accurately and precisely on any given day is tough. But then to do that 5 or 10 years into the future and identify what the differences are is equally, if not more, difficult. So the bad news: what if you've already been following some of these practices? So in general, the folks who are looking for carbon offsets are only going to pay for new practices. If you've been practicing no-till for 5 years, there might be some folks who would be interested in carbon offset contracts. If you've been practicing no-till for 30 years, you're basically excluded. The Microsofts of the world want to spend money to reduce carbon emissions other than they would have been. If you've been doing no-till and continue to do no-till, there wouldn't be any change in behavior by anyone. And so you're not, no one wants to pay for that. The general concept is called additionality. They want something additional to what would have been done otherwise. And of course, this causes a lot of anger, frustration with folks who've been doing no-till, because in many respects, you feel as if you've been doing the right thing for a long time, and then you're excluded, even though you're providing these benefits. And again, you've been providing these benefits in terms of carbon capture for years, if not decades. Some of the other requirements that we have, so typically in order to enter these contracts, you're going to have to share a lot of data, which is not necessarily easily accessible or easy to share. Again, the more fields that going from one business that's looking at offsets to another could lead to a lot more reporting that has to be done. And again, it's not easy, and oftentimes doesn't have to go back for a number of years. And again, that's just a condition to get these contracts. Another thing that happens for a lot of them is they want to be able to track what you're going to be doing as a farmer. So you can think, I oftentimes think about this is like just engaging with precision ag. So you're going to more closely track your inputs, your field operations, including possibly to those levels that you would consider precision ag. So that's kind of another step. And to me, it somewhat muddies the water. There's obviously a lot of benefits to doing those things generally, but it's another thing that you would have to do if you weren't already to enter into these types of contracts with some of the businesses that are currently engaged. One of the things that's nice about this, and can be nice and possibly not, is it strengthens the relationship between the farmer and that business. So if you're already engaged with the folks who come to you for carbon offsets, it could strengthen that relationship. Or you would know from the onset that as you decide to go no-till and to get these carbon offset payments, that you're going to be sharing a lot of information, not only now, but likely for quite some time. I already mentioned this a little bit. Thinking about this from an agronomic standpoint, thinking about it for farmers and their interaction with agronomists, this decision is a really, really big one. And it's one not to be taken lightly. And I think that's just thinking about introducing cover crops or alternative tillage on its own. I think it might be best for farmers to empower themselves, have their conversation with their agronomists before someone comes to the door with a carbon contract, so that they have already done their own homework. So they know for themselves that cover crops do or don't work, or no-till does or doesn't work, or how close it might be to go from not working to working. Again, this is really important because what the carbon folks are doing is they're framing it as, here's the price we're willing to pay for you to adopt these new practices, but these practices are complex. And again, to have that knowledge, that understanding is really quite important. And one of the things too, knowing, being here in the Northern Plains, a lot of folks do no-till, do strip till, do conservation till, some or all of those practices might be worthwhile. So the economics for many farmers here might be closer to break even or being profitable, making that switch just with the additional income that you might make from entering into a carbon contract. One of the questions we oftentimes get is, can I get this carbon offset payment and other payments? Well, it depends. Most of the contracts are open to allowing a farmer to stack. That is, you can get paid by someone else for the same practice. So for example, if a farmer participates in an NRCS program to help undergo this transition, maybe they were going to get a payment for cover crops. You could accept both. It's not one or the other, or refund or anything like that. That's something definitely take note of. One of the things looking forward, and again looking at carbon big picture, not just this carbon offset situation, we really don't know what future federal policy is going to be for carbon in agriculture. I would be somewhat optimistic first that it's going to happen, and relatively soon, possibly in the next farm bill, and that it's going to be presented in a positive way for farmers. That is, that you would likely receive a payment for adopting or possibly even already having these practices in place. At the same time, it's certainly possible that it could be regulated, heavily regulated, and that you might end up having to do these things, which might cost you money, or you might sell your carbon offsets and really need that carbon to meet a federal requirement or federal regulation, and have to figure out a way to get square with Uncle Sam. One of the considerations definitely to look at is if you are renting, to talk to your landowner about this. Again, these are really meant to be multi-year contracts. Many of them on their face are set up to be 10 years, 20 years, even longer. Not necessarily in terms of the initial payment, but in terms of the people who buy them being interested in what's going to go on the land. To make that type of commitment, a renter on his own probably really doesn't have the property rights to do that, but the landowner does. And it makes a lot of sense for this to be an issue of discussion for renters and landowners to see if this is something they want to pursue. And it, again, is complex. A lot of these practices benefit the land. If you're improving soil health, you're improving fertility, you're increasing yield potential, that benefits to the landowner, which might make them more interested in this than the farmer, the renter themselves might be. But again, I think it's really important to have that conversation. And I think it's also really important just for landowners, those especially who are absentee, to understand what this means or could mean, both to their renter, because you want to have a successful renter, but then also to their returns both now and in the future. Big picture stuff. One of the things I really ask farmers, because they're being told, they're being offered a price of carbon. Right now, the price of carbon that most farmers are being offered is somewhere between $20 and $40 a metric ton. But that's really not how it's presented to farmers. Farmers are said for additional $5 or $10 an acre, would you do no-till or would you do plant cover crops? And if you do that in that agreement, well, we're also going to take the carbon for free. That's how that carbon is generated. That's what they're going to take. But you as a farmer are typically not thinking about that value of carbon to another buyer, a buyer in the future, or possibly to the federal government, either in terms of an incentive or regulation. And that leads to this next question, is what other liabilities do you have in terms of carbon? And most farmers, we're not thinking about this yet, but we really need to. Farms, crop production, livestock production, you have greenhouse gas emissions. They're actually low, they're actually regularly declining, but they're there. And again, we could reach a point in the next few years where we see regulation that could negatively impact farmers, and especially if they sold their carbon or their carbon reducing potential for too little. At the same time, one of the things to consider is some of the contracts are, there's a 1-year contract out there. Some of these contracts look back a few years, but not forever. And if you don't sign a contract sooner, you might end up not having the opportunity to capture that benefit this year. So if you adopted cover crops or started making the conversion to no-till in 2022, you could get payment. If you waited till 2024, you might not be able to get payment for the next 2 years. And so that's something to consider as well. Some last quick points as we kind of get at the top of the hour and lunchtime. The markets are really young. One of the things to note is that what farmers are getting today and what the Microsofts of the world are paying are not the same amount. In general, the middlemen are taking 80 to 95% of the cut. Microsoft is paying usually around $200 a metric ton. Farmers are typically receiving $20 a metric ton. That middleman today, in general, is taking that $180. And that's a lot. It's important to note, too, that they have considerable upfront costs in terms of, legal costs, other business costs, marketing, all of those things, which are far from free. And what we're really seeing too is that a lot of the carbon offset folks are starting to have conversations or adjusting their contracts in order to provide some additional upside as those carbon offset prices might start increasing. One thing too is that it's really not a well-developed market. We're really just trying to figure this stuff out, and things are going to change over time. And one of the other things to look at too, in terms of being a food producer, as a food crop grower, you might have a better opportunity to create and capture value by looking at the folks who buy your crop, or going further down that supply chain. And again, because what that does is it makes it a scope 3 emission, which is a little bit more value than just a carbon offset. Can General Mills make a claim on their cereal box that says, hey, this is low carbon Cheerios, because they bought, low carbon oats from a North Dakota farmer? Those are the types of things where you might be able to get somewhat of a premium by staying within your supply chain. And we actually saw something similar to this. Cargill in October had an announcement, I think it was with Unilever, that they were going to work together and they were going to, do many of the same things, but provide a higher price for carbon, because they were looking at their farmers who are, almost certainly growing soybeans to, stay within that market, so they would have that direct chain back to the producer and those practices. One of the final things to note too, you can do this yourself. This is actually what happened up until the last year or so. Some Iowa farmers spent some time in the winter, documented their practices, submitted them to a registry themselves, and in some cases got checks for an excess of $100,000. You could still do this today. Essentially, what many of those middle folks are doing are they're making it easier, right? They're accommodating that transaction, collecting the information, doing it better because they do it often, going through the registry process and marketing those carbon credits. But again, this is something that any individual farmer can do, and some of them continue to do. And then one caveat, getting towards a close, we've actually been here before. So if you remember, about 15 years ago, we did have a lot of activity in the same carbon offset space, especially here in North Dakota. North Dakota Farmers Union took a very strong role as a leader to help generate these carbon offsets. And that market collapsed due to a lack of demand, or a collapse of demand. The Microsofts of the world disappeared. That could happen, although it looks, every day that things are a little bit more sure and that there's more traction this time around. Before I leave you, to me, the big questions are for you to ask yourself before the person with the contract shows up the door. Do cover crops or no-till work on my farm? Are those things that I might want to do? If they're a hard no, then it's probably not worth having the conversation. If they're a definite yes, then I would probably pick up the phone and call those folks, or respond to their somewhat one-way emails. If it's close, if they come to you, I would listen and see exactly, if they can push you past that tipping point. And then finally, I'd return back to that carbon liability issue. Again, what is that price of carbon to you? Knowing that in the future it could be substantially higher, knowing that in other markets it's substantially higher, and that you might be selling for too little, too early. So that was my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, if you have any questions in the future, feel free to send me an email or give me a call.